Hi everyone, in this chapter we'll be looking at research ethics, which are important component of a researcher's role in planning, designing a study, conducting it, as well as when the researcher presents his or her findings. So we'll take a look at what this topic is about and its importance in the researcher's role in doing his or her work, as well as the researcher's interaction with the research participants. All researchers have a responsibility to do ethical research, and the ethical responsibility is not just to the scholarly community that the researcher belongs to, but also to the participants who participate, who are involved in the study or the work, the experiments that the researcher conducts. Even us as students, we also have a responsibility as well, even if we are doing a small scale research project. In doing ethical research, we as researchers, we have to ensure that our participants understand their rights and as well as the responsibilities that they have in participating. There is a concept called the informed consent, and informed consent is a very important component or concept in this topic, in this chapter, as well as for this course, because participants must know what they are entering into, what is the research and what does the research entails, and how do they participate. And most importantly, participants must have the free will or the opportunity to say yes or no to his or her participation. In other words, research participants' participation in any research has to be voluntary. In a later slide in today's lecture, we'll see what that means in terms of allowing participants to have that free will to decide if they would like to participate and what it means to participate voluntarily. Ethical considerations, as we have just outlined in the last 1 or 2 minutes, are the key components as a researcher designs his or her study. It is very important that the researcher takes. Broadly, researchers have two major ethical responsibilities. The first one is to follow established guidelines that the researchers community has set. And these broad established guidelines can vary somewhat a little bit between from discipline to discipline, but generally they are very similar, especially for those who are working in the social sciences, just like us in communication. In the social science community, the different disciplines may have different ways of designing ethical responsibilities or provide different kinds of guidelines for the researchers in each of those domains of knowledge or the disciplines, so as to ensure that everyone is kind of following the rules. So think about like maybe any family that you belong to. There are different rules. Some family may say it's okay to do certain things. Other families may say it's not okay. So it's very similar in the sense that different research communities, different disciplines have those different rules. But generally, the major established guidelines are consistent across, and we'll be looking at three of them. All right, there'll be three of those major principles that guide these established guidelines, and we'll look at them in a few moments. The next and the second ethical consideration or responsibility that a researcher has is to consider the researcher's relationship in terms of his or her relationship with the participants. How does that affect the data collection? How does a researcher might interpret and report the data? And it's important that when we report the findings of a study, that we protect the identities of the participants. And later on in one of the slides, we'll be talking about anonymity and confidentiality. So those two are also key concepts in this chapter, and we'll touch on them when we get to those slides. Other ethical considerations following the two major ones that we saw in the previous slide will be how will consent, especially informed consent from the participants, be gained? In other words, how does the researcher gain the informed consent of the participants? Now, it's very important that the informed consent is received from the participant prior to the participant's participation. So it has to be given, the consent must be present, must be given from the participant to the researcher prior to or before the experiment or before the data is collected. How will the researcher manage confidentiality and anonymity? We'll look at them later on in one of the slides in today's lecture. Are the participants appropriate for the study? Meaning to say, are they eligible? Do they fit the requirements as well as the interest of the research design? If we were to study, say, college students between the ages of 18 and 25, then participants who are appropriate or who will be appropriate for the study must fulfill that criteria. If participants or individuals do not fulfill that criteria, then those individuals would not be appropriate because they don't satisfy the inclusion criteria. What are the potential physical and or psychological harms that the participants may experience? Now, some research might affect participants in ways that researchers may not have anticipated, or the researchers might have anticipated. And so we must be careful to take care of the well-being of the participants. For instance, researchers say in social work or sociology, they might be interested to talk about people's childhood. And so that is a very important research area, but we know that for some individuals, they might have very traumatic or painful childhoods. So by talking to those participants about their childhoods, and if that triggers or reminds them those traumatic events, then we can imagine that that is very impactful and that can harm psychologically the participants. And so if that were to happen, then what can the researcher do, or what must the researcher do to take care of the participants' well-being? So if that is a possibility, then the researcher must anticipate and must have plans put in place prior to conducting the study. How will the researcher's role affect the study? Meaning to say, the researcher's position may be, say, in an organization, or that in relation to the participant, how does that might influence how the participant respond to the requests for participants to participate in the research? Meaning to say, would there be undue bias, or would there be undue pressure on participants to say yes? Because that may or may not, or will likely infringe upon one of the principles, which is participants must have the free will, the voluntary aspect of participating studies, knowing what it is and voluntarily. Is the research design valid or credible? So that question pertains to whether the research design yields the kind of data that will be very useful in helping the researcher answer the hypothesis or research questions. And finally, another consideration will be, is the researcher capable of conducting the study? Now, does the researcher has the skills and the knowledge about the methods that he or she wants to deploy? Is he or she able to interpret and make sense of the data that will be collected? So the researcher's skills and ability, knowledge of the research area, those are important consideration in considering whether the researcher has the capability or the ability to conduct the study. The Belmont Report gives us 3 ethical principles, and these 3 ethical principles are generally consistent across the different academic disciplines. Earlier we talked about how different academic disciplines may have slightly different established guidelines, but generally all of them would fulfill these three ethical principles, or they kind of abide by these ethical principles. So we'll look at these three of them in turn in the next few slides, but this page gives us an overview of what they are, right? These three bullet points right here. And every research that is being conducted and will be conducted must follow as closely as possible to these three ethical principles. So let's take a look at the first principle, beneficence. In the previous slide, we looked at three ethical principles. This is the first one, beneficence, and it's about protecting participants' well-being. What does that mean? It means that when the researcher is going to conduct a study, the researcher must balance the potential benefits, as you see over here in this corner right here, bottom right corner, the potential benefits that the study might yield, as well as the potential risks that might be placed upon the participant. Okay, so not only would it should be beneficial, not only the research should be beneficial to that community that the researcher is studying either long-term or short-term, but also the benefits, potential benefits that the participant will yield by his or her participation. At the same time, what are the type of risks that the participant might encounter by his or her participation. We talked about how talking about childhood might raise some traumatic experiences or unpleasant experiences in people's lives. So that is a potential risk that a researcher has to think about. Now, of course, if the researcher's research does not entail talking about people's childhoods, about those events in their lives, then there is a low risk of that happening, but still researchers have to possibly anticipate possible risks that participants may encounter. All in all, it means that participants must be protected, their well-being protected, as well as to ensure that harm is minimized as much as possible for the participants. On the flip side, when we minimize harm, researchers also want to make sure that we maximize possible benefits to the participants. Sometimes, or actually a lot of times, participants' participation may not yield short-term benefit to the participants, but it may yield some long-term benefit to the participant and or to the participants' community. So for instance, we may say do some research on, say, pregnant women. So the study on pregnant women, maybe on certain medical condition that they may have, it may not help them directly because those data might take time to collect and to be analyzed. So by that point, the woman might no longer be pregnant. But it may help that woman in the future when she does decide to be pregnant again, or if she does not get pregnant again, then at least it will help other future pregnant women. So the researcher has to ensure that potential benefits are maximized, ideally to the participants. If not, then at the very minimum for those who may belong to the same category or the same characteristic, individuals of that characteristic. Of course, we talk about the benefits and risks. Ultimately, we have to make sure that the benefits will outweigh or should outweigh the potential risks for the participants' involvement in the research. The second ethical principle that we'll be looking at is called the respect for persons. And what that means is that we want to respect individuals knowing that, or believing that they have the ability to make their own decisions. All right, giving people the information for them to make the decisions themselves. We refrain from making decisions or helping them make choices for them, as in the participants, but we want to give them the information and giving them the space and the freedom to participate, for them to decide if they want to participate. They must have the freedom to volunteer, meaning to say they can choose to participate or not. It is entirely up to them. We cannot force them, we should not force them, and we should not make them feel like they must participate. So no coercion. We want to protect those who are not capable of making their own decisions, and oftentimes research communities will consider individuals who are in prison, so people who are prisoners. We want to protect them because they are in a setting where they have to follow orders. So if any research that's been done on prisoners, the researchers must ensure safety guidelines are put into place so that the prisoners are participating because they want to, because they choose to, and not because they are ordered to or because they are in a place where they must take orders. Other categories that are protected in research include pregnant women, as well as children under the ages of 18. So if any of those categories, the prisoners, the pregnant women, or children under 18, any kind of research that involves those individuals, the research protocol or the design has to take extra step to ensure that these individuals are participating out of free will. They really want to participate, they understand what they're participating in, and they have the choice to participate. One key thing about participation in terms of consent is that a participant must consent prior to the participation. There's an exception, but we'll talk about it in a later slide. But the consent is also necessary throughout the research process. So if during data collection, during the experiment, or the work that's been done, if the participant decides to withdraw his or her consent, then the ethical researcher must honor that request and remove the participant from the study. The ethical researcher should not use the data from that collection up to that point, reason because the participant withdrew his or her consent. So that is a very important consideration, that consent must be present and consent must be valid, and if the consent is withdrawn, then the researcher must respect that. The third ethical principle to consider is justice, and it's about issues of fairness. Researchers must treat all participants, or researchers must treat all participants fairly and equally, meaning to say we should not play favorites for one group over the other, giving one group preferential treatment and not for the other. So things like that, when we're not treating them equal, if we're not treating them the same, giving them fair, equal opportunity, then that is considered a violation of this ethical consideration or principle. So questions that we might be thinking about as researchers in thinking about whether we are implementing justice or serving justice in doing our research is that why do we choose a certain group or community to participate? Is it just because they are available, easily available? Sometimes easily availability is a legitimate and acceptable reason. So convenience sampling is one, and we won't be talking about convenience sampling today, but in a future chapter, yes. So sometimes easily available populations or samples, those are okay, those are legitimate, but in some design, using people who are easily accessible may not be the best choice and may not be the most ethical choice. So in those situations, then the researcher has to think, by choosing these individuals to participate, is it serving justice? Are we following the ethical principle of justice? Are we choosing individuals because they may find it difficult to say no to participating? If that puts the participants in that position where it's difficult for them to say no, to decline participation, then that is also considered as a violation of justice because there is not fair. They cannot have the free option to say yes or no to participating. Would the participants be manipulated to saying yes? So again, that is a violation. That's a problematic thing as well. If participants are manipulated to participate, again, that is a problem. That is not fair and is unjust, and so it's not treating participants equally and respecting them as individuals. Now that we have looked at the three ethical principles in the previous slides, the next concept we'll study in this chapter is something called the Institutional Review Board, or also known as the IRB. You see right up here. Sometimes we may call the IRB the Human Subjects Review Committee. So whenever you see either the IRB or the Human Subjects Review Committee, they mean the same thing. So what is the IRB? The IRB is a committee or a group of professors or scholars. Usually they work for some research organization or a university for sure. These entities oversee the research that's been conducted by the faculty or the researchers of that organization. And every time before the researcher conducts his or her research, the researcher must design, as we talked about in previous chapters, must design the study, think about ethical considerations, and submit that project proposal or the protocol that the researcher is going to use to this body, the IRB, and have their approval. So when the IRB says this is okay, you may proceed with the design that you have proposed, then the researcher goes forward. That is an ethical step. That is an expected expectation that researchers have on their colleagues, meaning to say other researchers who do study. The IRB helps to see if the protocol or the proposed project is sound, if it's reasonable, if it makes sense. Why do the researcher wants to tap into certain communities or populations as an sample? So those are things that the IRB thinks about or cares about, essentially taking care of the well-being of the participants and making sure that the research will be conducted ethically. Another piece of the IRB is that the IRB also wants to ensure that the researchers will present the findings of the studies in an ethical fashion. So we talked about the rights and welfare of participants, making sure that the research participants' welfare are taken care of. Proposals should be submitted prior to data collection, and that is to make sure that the researchers have thought about the ethical considerations that we have covered so far. In the IRB proposal, here are a few pieces that the researcher will present in the proposal, the research questions or the hypotheses that the researcher intends to use to study, a brief literature review that informs the research questions and the hypotheses. So you recall that these elements right here, these first two, are basically the components that you have seen in the previous two chapters. The IRB proposal will also describe how the researcher will recruit participants, how will the participants be selected, and whether the participants may or may not be compensated. The IRB proposal will outline how informed consent will be received from the participant, how would the participants receive the information needed to let them understand what the research is about and to get their consent to participate. The type of research methods that the researcher will be applying, and we talked about how research is something that requires researchers who have the capability or ability to execute the study. So the research methods, the qualification of the researcher in his or her knowledge and application of those methods. What are the potential benefits and risks to participants? So again, maximizing benefits, minimizing risks to participants. How do we protect participants' anonymity and confidentiality aspects? So when we talk about anonymity, it means that the data will not have any connection to the participants' identities. We do not know, or we do not expose or reveal the participants' identities, so things like their names or maybe some unique identification numbers. What is confidentiality means is that we're protecting again the participants' identities, but in a way that that people who are not related to the research project or team will not have access to those information. So think about, say, your medical history. When you go to see a doctor at a medical clinic, when they take your medical history, those information will be confidential, meaning to say, unless people who are working there has a need to know those information about, say, your medical past, there is no way that someone should have access to those information. So that is confidentiality. Finally, the IRB proposal also includes the investigator or the researcher's background, meaning to say the researcher's qualification, knowledge of the research methods, experience in that field of research, things like that. Informed consent, as I have talked about at the start of today's lecture, is a crucial information that must be received from the participants before they participate. Information must be given to them about how data will be collected, and ideally prior to data collection, and as well as available to participants at a later time as well. What are the obligations and the responsibilities that the researcher has towards the participant? So things like protecting their identities and anonymity, as well as confidentiality, those things that we talked about in previous slides, those are the researcher's obligation. Again, participants must consent voluntarily, meaning to say they must be willing and are able to say yes freely, and they have the choice to withdraw their consent even during the conduct of the research. Ideally, it should be in a written format, although sometimes researchers might get an IRB approval to get informed consent via, say, an oral agreement, so they can say yes, or it could be based on certain aspects, such as if the participant will continue or to click on the next web page, for example, that will be implied consent, and that will be acceptable as well. But again, it depends on the research proposal and if the IRB accepts that as an appropriate way to get consent. Elements of informed consent provides information about the researcher, the organization that the researcher works at or is affiliated to, the purpose of the study, why are we doing, or why is the researcher doing the study, who is it going to benefit, features of the research process, meaning to say what will the participants be involved in, what are the steps that the participants will be taking, what will they be doing, how would they be participating, or what can they expect during the process of their participation, how long would the process be, the duration, is it just one time or is it multiple times, possible risks and benefits that the participants may be involved, how would confidentiality and anonymity be assured, how would the researcher will protect the research participants' identities. So these are things that will be covered in the informed consent that will be shared with the participants. Any potential physical or psychological harms that might be inflicted on the participant, is there deception used? Oftentimes, if deception is absolutely necessary for research to be conducted, informed consent will most likely not be received or sought in the beginning of the research, but definitely after the data has been collected, researchers must ethically discharge their obligations and to let participants know that deception was applied. We'll talk about deception in a slide later in this chapter. Who can the participants contact if there is a need to follow up on the research? Is there a note that the participation is voluntary? At what point can participants withdraw their consent without penalty? At what point can they say no to continuing their participation? Consent form for quantitative research traditionally would be in a format like maybe a first page of a paper survey, or maybe the first page of a website, for instance, where it lays out the information that we talked about in the previous slide, and you may say if you were to consent, then click yes, or maybe click on the next page, and that will mean that participant is willing to consent. It will lay out the exact procedures, meaning to say the steps that will be involved, that the participants will be participating in. What would the participants be doing step by step, things that they will do, and what kind of elements or issues that they might be exposed to. So if the IRB perceives that those materials or exposure to those materials can be threatening or distasteful or harmful to the participants, those information should also be presented upfront in the consent form. In terms of qualitative research consent forms, they can look a little bit different. Oftentimes, it will still cover the basic elements that we have been talking about this chapter, but they may look a little bit different than the consent forms used in quantitative research. Two key questions we'll be thinking about is that are we studying interactions that happen naturally in public setting? So if it happens naturally in an open environment, a public setting, will consent be necessary? And this is something important to think about, because if you think about, say, conversations that happen in a hospital, for instance. Hospitals are public spaces, people come in and go out. There is a lobby area where anyone can be sitting there waiting for their turn to be called, or there might be family members waiting for their loved ones who is receiving treatment. So in those places, can we say that consent is not necessary since it's a public space? So a lot of scholars actually will say the answer is yes, we still need consent, because we'll still consider, even though it's a public space, it's really very private, because it might involve conversations between a physician and a patient, talking about a patient's medical history or things that can trigger strong emotions in individuals. So even if we are doing a study in, say, the holding area or the waiting area of a hospital or a medical clinic, even though it's really public, still is considered really private in terms of research, and we want to make sure that if a study is conducted in that space, we have the participants' consent, informed consent. Another consideration is whether the researchers' interactions with the participants would have any kind of negative impact or consequence on the participants. How would it affect them negatively? If that were to happen, how will the researcher ensure that the risks are minimized and the well-being of the participants are protected? All in all, every IRB is a little bit different, varies from organization to organization. So researchers who are interested to do a study, whether it's quantitative or qualitative research, they must always run their proposals, run it by their respective IRBs. Ethical consideration in conducting research. Is there any deception involved? So if deception is involved, researchers may have extra hurdles to clear, because we don't want to deceive participants. We don't want to lie to people in order to get information from them. That is not ethical, that is not right. And so deception will be something that is will be scrutinized closely to ensure why it is going to be used. in situations where it's absolutely necessary to use deception, then the researchers must satisfy the IRB's guidelines in making sure that the deception is absolutely necessary and that participants' rights and well-being again will be protected. Would that be a use of confederates? What that means is that confederates are individuals that participants thought were other participants, but in reality, confederates are people who are part of the research study, who are embedded in the setting to influence participants' thinking or behaviors. So using confederates to influence or to change or to make people feel comfortable or uncomfortable. Before the participation or during the participation. So you can imagine by using confederates is a form of deception because we are manipulating the way how the participant is going to react or act or talk. So if that is being applied, if confederates are part of the study, then we're in some ways we're applying deception, and again, deception has to be absolutely necessary to be used before the IRB will approve the use of deception or confederates. What kind of physical psychological harm may these elements present? So researchers must think about that. How would that affect again the participants' identities? How would the data be collected? Would it be video recorded, videotaped, audio recorded, or what kind of format or media will be used? So those are important things. And finally, how would participants be debriefed at the end of the study so as to inform again the participants what the researchers have done, or what are, say, preliminary findings or instincts that the researchers have gathered from the data collected so far. Follow-up questions from participants if they have any questions that they may have to ask about the study, or maybe some thoughts that came to mind as they participate in the research. So it's a way to wrap up the participants' involvement, to give them the opportunity to ask questions or to make some comments about their participation or their involvement. After the researcher has collected the data and analyzed it, and as the researcher is going to present those findings to the larger community, the researcher has to ensure that the findings that are presented, the analysis, the interpretations must be accurate, because the researcher ultimately is responsible for the accuracy, the validity of the study that he or she puts out in public. Because the findings will be used by other researchers in their own work, as well as to implement policies or projects to help other people. So it's crucial that the researcher is ethical and will report those findings ethically and accurately. We also want to make sure that researchers avoid plagiarism. So not just researchers, but all of us, even as students, we should always be mindful of what plagiarism is and how that can happen. So we want to make sure that we use quotation marks if we are quoting someone directly. So a direct quote, we have to make sure that not only direct quotation marks are used, but we have to ensure proper citations are applied so that we give credit to the sources or the individuals whom the ideas we gain from. When we summarize other people's work or ideas or research and we paraphrase it, we also have to make sure that we give proper citation, again, to give them credit, acknowledging that the ideas and contributions were not from us, but from somewhere else, some other source, maybe another researcher, maybe another book or a scholarly article that we read. All in all, we are interested to protect the identities of the participants, making sure that we protect their identities and taking care of their well-being, maximizing the benefits that they will gain from their participation, as well as to minimize potential risks that they may encounter by their participation. So all of that wraps up this chapter on research ethics